Hey, welcome back to Fazbear Frights again. Today we're reading the final story in Fetch, which is called Out of Stock. And just so you know, the third book is coming out in a month, and I pre-ordered it, so it should show up very soon. And I'm really looking forward to read it, because it sounds like it's going to be a good one. Also, my microphone has been being really finicky lately. Actually, I don't think it's the microphone, I think it's the computer. When I connect the microphone, so, I don't think it should be a problem, but it might be, so, guess there's only one way to find out. Out of stock. It was just like Oscar to be on the losing end of the deal. It had always been that way, from the time his dad went to the hospital for a tonsillectomy and contracted a fatal infection, or the time they had to move to the cheaper end of town, to all the times Oscar had to help his mom at the Royal Oaks nursing home, while the rest of his friends spent their allowances at the mall. So it was no surprise to Oscar when he learned that the plush trap chaser, a light-activated chomping green rabbit, and by far Oscar's favorite character from the Freddy Fazbear world, would go on sale on the most ridiculous day, at the most ridiculous time imaginable. Friday morning, Oscar screamed. Man, you've got to get over it, said Raj, kicking the same stone down the sidewalk he'd been torturing the entire way to school. But the injustice of it, Oscar said. It's a kid's toy. Why would it go on sale when every kid in the known universe is in school? Oscar swatted at a low-hanging branch like it wronged him. Did you hear Dwight already got one? Isaac asked, bringing up the rear. What? Raj stopped for a minute, now adequately outraged. He hadn't even heard of Freddy Fazbear before last year. Apparently his dad made a call. His dad's always making a call, pouted Isaac. Dwight's a jerk, said Raj, and on this the boys all agreed. It was so much easier to hate Raj than to admit that they weren't the types who had dads who would make calls to get ugly green rabbits that stood the height of a toddler and maintained the speed of an actual rabbit. Well, never get it, not if we have to wait until 4 o'clock, Isaac said. We could, Oscar started, but Raj cut him off. No, we can't, he said. How do you... We can't ditch. It's not possible. I have 2 strikes already. One more and my mom's going to send me to boot camp. Come on, she wasn't serious about that, Oscar said. You don't know my mom, said Raj. One time, my sister talked back to her, and my mom wouldn't let her talk for a week. That didn't actually happen, Isaac chuckled. Oh no? Ask Avni. She says by the 6th day, it's like she forgot how to talk at all. Raj looked into the distance, haunted by the specter of his mother, while Oscar turned to Isaac. Don't look at me, I have to walk Jordan home. Oscar knew that he couldn't argue with that one. Even as little brothers go, Jordan was okay, and Oscar knew for a fact that Isaac's mom would go nuclear if he even thought about leaving Jordan alone until she got home from work at 3 o'clock. There was no going around it. Despite all of Oscar's big ideas, he knew he was too afraid to actually go through with it. Ditching school was like a mortal sin to his mom, who'd fought hard for her own education while raising Oscar by herself. Oscar and his friends would have to wait until 4 o'clock. The day was agonizingly long. Mr. Tallis made the entire class recite the preamble of the Constitution over and over until they got it right. Miss Davney popped a completely unfair quiz on isotopes. Coach Riggins made them run laps around the field, even though it was still muddy from the last rain. Oscar thought maybe he'd never faced a more miserable day. Then, at 2:33, it got worse. 2 minutes before the final bell rang, Oscar was called to the front office. Now, he pleaded with Mr. Enriquez? I don't know. His geometry teacher shrugged, helpless to bail Oscar out, despite his being Oscar's favorite teacher. Sorry, Mr. Avila, nobody ever said sophomore year was cruelty-free. He turned to Raj and Isaac in the only class they'd ever shared since they met on the playground in 3rd grade. Mustering all his strength, he tried not to choke on his sacrificial offering. Wait for me until 3:30. If I'm not back by then... The whole class sat in witness. Then go without me. Raj and Isaac nodded solemnly, and Oscar scooped up his notebooks and bag and cast one last glance at Mr. Enriquez. It's your mom, he murmured, patting Oscar firmly on the shoulder. Mr. Enriquez knew Oscar's mom sometimes needed Oscar's help at the Royal Oaks nursing home. He didn't exactly know what his mom's job was, but it had something to do with making sure the whole place didn't come undone. His mom was important. The secretary at the front desk was waiting impatiently for Oscar, the receiver already in hand. "Thought you got lost," she said humorlessly. "Does your mom know this is why most parents get their kids cell phones?" Oscar bared his teeth into something simulating a smile. "I think she just likes hearing your voice on the regular," he said, and the secretary matched his smile. "Besides, phones aren't allowed at school." Not that we can afford one, he thought, not without a little venom toward the secretary. Oscar took the phone from her hand fast, because she looked like she was going to smack him with it. "LM, Mr. Devereaux, another French name. I'm sorry. Look, I don't know." "Mr. Devereaux isn't doing well today," Oscar's mom said. His mom only used his nickname, LM, code for little man, when her need was dire. Not this. Not today. Mr. Devereaux was possibly the world's oldest man, and when he was out of sorts, there were only a few people who could reason with him, enough to get him to take his meds or eat something. For some inexplicable reason, Oscar was one of those people. "Where's Connie?" Oscar whined, referencing the only orderly to whom Mr. Devereaux responded. Spanish now? Puerta Vallarta? Where I should be," his mom said. "Besides, he's asking for you." Oscar handed the phone back to the secretary, who already had her purse in hand as she tapped her white-tipped fingernail on the counter between them. "I trust you've resolved your crisis. I have to get the toy box before they sell out of plush traps. I have 5 nephews." It was almost too much for Oscar to bear. 5 fewer plush traps after Mrs. Beastly in his head, snagged whatever might be left for her undeserving nephews. Oscar dragged his feet in misery all the way to the number 12 city bus, transferred to the 56 line, and walked the quarter-mile from the bus stop to his mom's work, moping into the lobby of the Royal Oaks nursing home. Irvin, seated at the reception desk, nodded to him from under his headphones. "Dude's in a bad way, big man," Irvin said loudly, his volume unchecked by the deep bass line emanating from his playlist. "He says Marilyn wants to steal his soul." Oscar nodded. Irvin was well versed in the oddities of Royal Oaks, including Mr. Devereaux's chronic, baseless paranoia. Hearing Irvin confirm what his mom had already told him on the phone did nothing to alter Oscar's position of unconditional surrender. He would be here all afternoon, likely into the evening, trying to calm Mr. Devereaux. The plush trap chaser, if he'd ever even had a chance at getting it in the first place, would now never be his. The automatic doors whooshed open, revealing the back of his mom's tall figure. She handed a clipboard back to an orderly Oscar had never met before. This place went through orderlies like Oscar went through electric blue fruit punch. "Make sure Miss Delia doesn't get any dairy after 4 p.m., his mom said. "She'll fart so much we'll have to quarantine the room. And I promise you, I'll make sure you're the only one assigned to that wing for the entire night." The new orderly nodded earnestly, clearly shaken, and hurried away with the clipboard just as Oscar's mom turned to smile at him, arms extended. That was the thing about his mom. She could always be counted on for a hug strong enough to crack ribs. Even the time she threatened to put a bounty on Oscar's head after he rescued a bat and set it free in the house, she still managed to hug him hard enough to make him sore the next day. "Mr. Devereaux thinks Marilyn wants to steal his soul, I heard," Oscar said. "After 18 years, you'd think Marilyn had earned the benefit of a doubt." "No rest for the truly suspicious," Oscar said, and his mom smiled at him. "Thank you, little man. You are my angel." "Mom," he said, looking around to make sure no one heard. Oscar began to think about compromises. Maybe if he gave Raj or Isaac half the amount, one of them could be persuaded to let him take partial plush-trap custody. Oscar managed a weak smile at his mom, and wondered if the fates might bestow upon him a plush trap if they witnessed his angelic behavior. He knew better than to hope, though. When they arrived in Mr. Devereaux's doorway, he found the old man staring into the corner of his room, his eyes trained like lasers ready to vaporize. "It started," Mr. Devereaux said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What started?" Oscar asked, not so much curious as eager to begin this process. "She's been plotting this whole time. I should have known. She waited until I let my guard down." "Come on, Mr. D, you don't really believe that." I can feel my soul slipping away. It's oozing out of my pores, Oscar. Mr. Devereaux didn't sound afraid. Rather, he seemed resigned to his fate, and Oscar thought maybe they had something in common today. But why would she do that? Oscar asked. She loves you. She's shared your room every night for almost 2 decades. Don't you think if she wanted your soul, she would have taken it by now? Trust cannot be rushed, young man, Mr. Devereaux said. Good fortune cannot be predicted. It was these seeds of wisdom that kept Oscar interested in Royal Oak's longest-term resident. No matter how many times Mr. Devereaux let some sage observation slip, Oscar was surprised every time. Like Mr. Devereaux could sense what was occupying Oscar's mind. Even if Mr. Devereaux's own mind was like a sieve, his thoughts slipping through holes into some bottomless abyss. Maybe Marilyn isn't stealing your soul. Maybe she's guarding it. Holding it for safekeeping, Oscar posited. Mr. Devereaux shook his head. I thought of that. It's a tempting theory, but she should have asked permission. These are the times when Oscar struggled, when logic had to win. I mean, it's not like she could actually ask you, he said. Of course she can, Mr. Devereaux raged, and Oscar put up his hands, trying to ease Mr. Devereaux before the new orderly came scurrying around the corner. Okay, but just stick with me for a minute, Mr. D, Oscar said, sneaking 2 steps into Mr. Devereaux's room. Maybe she thought, since you were close enough, that you wouldn't mind if she, borrowed your soul for a bit. Mr. Devereaux cut his eyes toward Oscar, suspicious. She didn't tell you to say that, did she? No, of course not. No one could come close to the, relationship you two have. Mr. Devereaux looked into the corner of his room that had held his attention until that moment. Well, Marilyn, what do you have to say for yourself? Oscar followed Mr. Devereaux's stare, and now they were both staring at the same ancient calico cat who had slept on the pillow by the window of Mr. Devereaux's room for as long as Mr. Devereaux had slept in his own bed. She didn't come in here with Mr. Devereaux, at least according to legend. She'd been a neighborhood stray, but one day the staff found her in the room, and without objection from the rotating cast of residents, Marilyn had remained, finding Mr. Devereaux's company the most pleasing, despite his periodic disdain or outright hatred. No amount of scratching behind the ears or catnip offerings by anyone else could entice her away from Mr. Devereaux. Maybe she really was after his soul. Marilyn blinked her slow cat blink at Mr. Devereaux. Well, I think we both know what that means, Oscar improvised, and for a second Mr. Devereaux looked confused, but after a moment of contemplation over the loud purring of Marilyn, something inside him settled. All right, then. It seems Marilyn owes you yet another debt of gratitude, young man. Marilyn stretched on her chair and yawned, but Oscar wasn't looking for gratitude from a cat. He was looking for a way out. Sit down, young man, sit down, Mr. Devereaux said, and Oscar let his last hope slip away. This was to be his entire afternoon. Oscar slumped in the chair closest to the door. Mr. Devereaux stared at him with the watery eyes of an old man. My soul may be in trouble, he said, but your heart is stolen. Oscar tried to laugh. If he didn't, he might cry. It was just the latest in what was panning out to be a lifetime of almost. He had almost made varsity baseball, but he dislocated his elbow. He had almost saved up for a cell phone, but someone picked his pocket on the train. He had almost had a whole family, but then he lost his dad. If you could earn a trophy for almost, he'd probably fall just shy of the honor. Ah, yes, Mr. Devereaux continued. Love is a many-splendored thing, until it crushes you to pieces. It's not like that, Oscar said. It was ridiculous to set the record straight. Mr. Devereaux might or might not even remember this conversation, but he needed someone to know. He needed someone to confide in, and truly he had never known a better listener than this man whom he'd never seen standing once, whose first name he didn't even know. It's just a stupid toy, Oscar said, but even as he tried to diminish the plush trap, he felt his heart squeeze. It broke, Mr. Devereaux said. It was never mine in the first place, said Oscar, and Mr. Devereaux nodded slowly. Marilyn began the long practice of cleaning herself. And I take it the toy will never be yours, Mr. Devereaux said. Oscar felt ridiculous hearing it in those terms, hardly something that should be causing a 12-year-old to despair. It's not even that special, Oscar lied. "Ah, but the toy is only the stem that breaks the ground," Mr. Devereaux said, and Oscar looked up from his feet to stare into the old man's eyes. He might have been slipping into one of his lapses. But Oscar was surprised to see Mr. Devereaux looking right at him. The reason for wanting is what lies underneath. It's the soil that feeds the want. Mr. Devereaux leaned a little closer to Oscar, pressing his veiny arm against the guardrail, enough to make Oscar nervous. "I think you have tilled quite a lot of soil in your handful of years on this earth. So much wanting, but you've never been able to pluck the fruits of your labor from the ground, have you?" Oscar was never any good at growing things. He killed every plant he tried to water, every fish he tried to nurture. "I don't think you know," he said, but Mr. Devereaux didn't let him finish. "The best cultivators are the ones who know when the right time is to pick the crop." Oscar was trying, he really was, but Mr. Devereaux was losing him fast. "Mr. D, you're really nice to try." "Ugh," Mr. Devereaux groaned like something hurt. He leaned away from his position against the rail and arched his back. Oscar could hear something pop deep inside the man's rickety bones. Marilyn paused her bath long enough to make sure Devereaux was okay. "A grower maybe, but a thinker you're not," Mr. Devereaux said to Oscar. "Sometimes you have to know when to go for it, even when it doesn't look possible." Oscar stared at Mr. Devereaux. "Quit sitting here and find your precious toy," Mr. Devereaux yelled, his phlegmy throat catching on the words, and he began to hack. Marilyn wound herself into a tight ball in her chair. The new orderly appeared out of nowhere, standing in the doorway, but reluctant to walk any closer. "Is everything all right in here, Mr. Dev?" "No, everything is not all right, you daft ferret. Go and get me a glass of water, for the love of—" The orderly scurried away, but Oscar couldn't seem to get up from his chair. He was frozen in place, contemplating the prophecy he'd received in a haze of cat hair and disinfectant. "What, you don't think she looks like a ferret?" "No one should have a face that small," Mr. Devereaux said to Oscar. "But what if it's sold out everywhere?" Oscar said, his brain finally coming back online. "Don't you young people have the internet? Or your computer phones or iWhatsits? Somebody has the stupid toy somewhere. The point is, quit tilling. It's time to pick." The orderly returned with a small yellow cup, and Mr. Devereaux took it from her roughly before turning on his side, his back to her and to Oscar. Marilyn poked an ear up just to be sure all was well before resettling into her coil. In the space of 5 seconds, Mr. Devereaux was snoring loudly, his ribs rising and falling inside his threadbare pajamas. "Looks like you tuckered him out," the orderly said to Oscar. "You're my hero." Oscar felt dizzy by the time he made his way back to the front desk. His mom was hustling down the hall with 3 orderlies in tow, each following her like ducklings, struggling to keep up. "You're a good soul," his mom said to Oscar, without looking up from her clipboard. Oscar knew she meant it, though. She was just busy. "He calls the new orderly a ferret," Oscar said. His mom shrugged and mumbled something about a small face. "Anyway, I told Raj and Isaac I'd meet up with them," Oscar said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Oh, anything fun happening?" she said, still absorbed in her paperwork. One of the orderlies was trying to get her attention. Oscar stared at the top of his mom's head, the gray streak that ran from her cowlick down to her crown suddenly looking larger, like age had poured over her head while she slept one night. "Nah," he said, "nothing special." She cupped his chin gently in her palm, finally looking up, and Oscar smiled back because she was always trying her hardest. She always had. He turned his heel toward the doors. "Oh, Oscar, can you pick up some "Sorry, Mom, gotta run," Oscar said, as he fled the lobby and returned to the safety of the vestibule. He was almost out the door when Irvin, still bobbing his head to whatever played in his ears, yelled over the music. "You got a message," he said. "Huh?" Oscar said. "What?" said Irvin, then pulled his headphones around his neck. You got a message from the short one. What's his name? Isaac?" "He called here for me?" Oscar said, utterly confused. He couldn't remember a single time his friends had ever tried reaching him here, even though it seemed like he just spent as much time at Royal Oaks as he did in his own home. If anything, sometimes Raj and Isaac would wait for Oscar to finish helping his mom, wasting time in the vestibule while Irvin ignored them. "Said you gotta meet them at the mall. Something about a trap," Irvin said. "The mall? Not the toy box? Wait, when did they call?" Oscar demanded, which got Irvin's attention. Well, let me just check the messaging service, he said, reaching for an imaginary memo pad. Sorry, it's just 10 minutes, maybe, Irvin said, softening. 10 minutes. If it took him 20 on the bus, another 10 to walk from the bus stop to the mall, there might still be time to get there before they close. I gotta go. Have fun. Whatever, Irvin said. As he pulled his headphones back over his ears, the door was already swishing closed behind Oscar. Oscar danced around the bus stop like he had to pee, leaning off the sidewalk into the street to see if he could spot the marquee on every passing bus. Drivers honked him out of the way, but he barely noticed them. Finally, the number 56 bus arrived, slowing to an agonizingly slow stop and sighing down to meet the curb. It was standing room only, and Oscar felt irrational fury toward anyone who dared to pull the stop cord. It seemed there wasn't a 2-block stretch where they didn't have to stop to let someone on or off, and Oscar was about to burst with impatience. When the mall stop finally came, he was so eager to get off, he nearly forgot to pull the cord for himself. Whoa, here, he yelled up to the driver, who grumbled something about not being his personal I hate these French words. Oscar hollered a quick apology over his shoulder as he booked it through the thick grove of eucalyptus trees that were definitely someone's private property to get to the mall's east entrance, the closest one to the emporium. The emporium had nearly closed 3 different times, always on the verge of bankruptcy, always rescued at the last minute by some mysterious financier who, according to chipper new anchors on the evening broadcast, couldn't bear to see another independent business succumb to one of the big chain toy stores. It might have been an act of charity if the emporium hadn't been so gross. Oscar was pretty sure the place had never been mopped. Mystery splatters lined the baseboards all around the cavernous store, not a single stain ever moving from where it had made its home. Oscar himself had made one of those stains when he was 11, puking up an entire radiation green big slurp right in front of the beach ball display. Though he tried not to look, every time he went into the emporium, he saw the telltale green flecks that had never been thoroughly scrubbed from the back wall. The store itself always seemed to be half-lit, the fluorescent lights high above buzzing and flickering like they resented being on. But maybe the most depressing part of the emporium was its perpetually unstocked shelves. They'd carry maybe a handful of the really good toys everyone was clamoring for that year, but the rest of the cavernous store was occupied by half-emptied displays of dusty generic dolls, action figures, and playsets that the parents who were too late or too broke had to resort to. Oscar knew for a fact that his mom had stopped into the emporium more than a few times, always at the end of her nightly shift, looking for the closest facsimile to a brand-name toy her small paycheck could buy. Oscar never let her see his disappointment. But the emporium was the only toy shop located in the mall. All the rest in town were the big standalone stores. If Isaac was telling him to meet him there, they must know something that everyone else in the entire town didn't. Only, that didn't seem to be the case once Oscar opened the door to the east entrance. Even from far away, he could see a squirming line of people trying to squeeze into the emporium. It was more foot traffic than the store probably had in a year. Oscar slowed to a walk as he approached the crowd with caution, so unnerved by the sight of that many people pushing to get into the emporium of all places. Sure enough, there at the register by the door, a single petrified teenager was flailing spectacularly at urging people to be quiet and patient. Poor guy probably had zero idea of what he was walking into that day for his shift. Oscar! Oscar searched for Isaac in the crowd, but as Irvin had reminded him less than an hour before, Isaac was the short one. He was hard enough to find in a crowd half that size. Over here! This time it was Raj, and finally after sweeping the jostling crowd 3 times, Oscar spotted his friend jumping above the surrounding heads. He wasn't all that far from the front of the line, which had to mean they somehow got the inside track on the inventory. Oscar squeezed his way past a gaggle of angry customers. Hey, there's a system here, kid, one guy growled, and Oscar had to hide his laugh because, really? This was a system? Oscar ducked a couple more grumbles before finally reaching Raj and Isaac, the latter on tiptoe, trying to see how far they were to the front. Dude, we tried the toy box, marbles, and that place on 23rd and San Juan, said Raj, skipping right to the point. We even went to that weird organic place on 5th Avenue that only sells wooden toys. If they ever had it at all, they sold out in like 5 minutes, said Raj. But the Emporium has them? Oscar asked, still in disbelief. He hadn't actually seen anyone leave with one, and seeing was believing. Not on the shelves, Raj said, getting to the good part. We saw Thad outside of Rockets, and he was holding this big Emporium bag, so we knew something had to be up. He didn't want to, but he showed us. Well, he showed us the top of the box, but he definitely had one. He was all smug about it too, said Isaac. I guess his sister's dating the assistant manager here, and he said they got a small stock of them, but the manager wasn't putting them on the shelf. Probably wanted to sell them himself online, Raj said. Jerk. Guess word got out, Oscar said, watching the crowd watch everyone else. No one wanted to be the first in line to hear we just sold the last one. The crowd surged suddenly, knocking the entire Quasi line forward, and a general rumble of protest burbled from the customers. Isaac fell against Oscar, who fell against the lady in front of him, who complained louder than the rest. "Excuse me," she said, only half turning to shoot Oscar a dirty look. The secretary, Mrs. Beastly, the one with 5 nephews. "Oh no," Oscar whispered. "She's going to clean them out," he hissed to Raj and Isaac. "She can't. Limits 1 per customer," said Raj. "Don't worry. I've got a good feeling." Oh well, if you have a feeling, Oscar rolled his eyes, but secretly he was grateful for Raj's optimism. It's not like Oscar had any of his own to offer. Mr. Devereaux's pep talk about harvesting was a distant memory. After an entire eon had passed, the line crawled forward, and the secretary from the boys' school was next. "What do you mean, limit 1 per person?" "Sorry, ma'am, that's the rule," said the clerk, looking like he was maybe seconds from a meltdown. "Whose rule?" "My manager's, ma'am," he said, and the line behind them sighed loudly. "Haven't you been listening, lady? He said it 100 times already," groaned one guy. "Well, what am I supposed to tell my nephews?" Mrs. Beastly asked. "How about you tell them, I don't know, that the limit was 1 per person," the guy said, and Oscar had to admire this. No one at school dared talk to her that way. "Ma'am," the clerk interrupted, I can sell you one, but you'll have to move along." The secretary gave him a look that Oscar was pretty sure could melt human brains. I mean, if it's okay," he said, but it was too late. He was already liquefying. Mrs. Beastly slammed her giant purse on the counter and huffed her way through counting out her cash, then exchanged it for one glorious plush-trap chaser. It was the first time Oscar had actually seen one in the flesh, or stuffing, or whatever. Even from behind the cellophane window of the box, the thing looked perfectly terrifying. Its plastic eyes bulged from even wider eye sockets, making the face look skeletal. The mouth hung open to reveal lines of unsettlingly pointed canine-looking teeth. With the toy standing almost 3 feet tall, the clerk had to stand on tiptoe to get the box over the counter and into the secretary's grasping hands, and she shooed away the plastic bag he offered, decidedly done with this entire transaction. She walked away in a huff, dozens of eyes following her purchase out the door before returning their attention to the keeper of the treasure. The crowd surged forward, but it wasn't necessary. Oscar, Raj, and Isaac were practically crawling over the counter. "1 plush-trap chaser, please," Oscar said breathlessly. "If there's only 1 left, we can split it." The boys shoved their hands into their pockets to pool their money, a compromise they hadn't even needed to discuss. If 1 plush-trap was all they could get, then they'd just have to share it. All for 1 and all that. They understood how scarcity worked. "So sorry," the guy behind the counter said, but he didn't look sorry so much as terrified. "What do you mean, sorry?" Oscar said, but on some level he already knew. No, Oscar shook his head. "Don't say it." The clerk swallowed. "We're sold out." The crowd erupted in protest, and whether it was conscious or not, the clerk gripped the counter like he expected the floor to fall out from under him. "It can't be," Raj said, but Oscar could barely hear him over the roar of angry customers. He looked at Oscar like he was begging him to lie and tell him it was all just a joke. There was enough for them. They wouldn't walk away empty-handed. It couldn't possibly be that Oscar had come so far for another almost. But Oscar looked at the petrified face of the clerk. What reason would he have for lying now? More than that, what reason would he have for angering a crowd already on the brink of revolt? The The seed of disappointment was sprouting its roots in Oscar's stomach as the scene before him played in slow motion. He pictured himself walking away with Raj and Isaac, circling them all and dragging their feet back to the bus stop, unable to find the words to express how this particular brand of letdown. Unable to describe how it wasn't the plush trap chaser. Not really. It was the confirmation that people like him weren't meant to hope for things. While the clerk stood with his hands up, like his trembling palms could somehow comfort the angry masses, Oscar drifted to the side of the counter and tried to process yet another disappointment. He felt cut off from the scene around him, until a few intriguing words lured his attention away from the crowd's protests and the clerk's weak responses. "Call police," a woman's voice said. "Who processed return?" a gruff man's voice demanded. "Real," a squeaky teenager's voice said. "Human?" the woman asked. Oscar inched past the counter and peered around a few stacks of cardboard boxes. Just beyond the boxes, 3 employees clustered around something Oscar couldn't see. Though their backs were mostly to Oscar, he was far enough from the crowd now that he could hear the employees discussing whatever it was they were looking at. "No doubt about it, they look real," said a teenage staffer as he hunched over the thing. "They're sure not from the manufacturer," said a man gruffly, who Oscar guessed to be the greedy manager, judging by his authoritative tone. "How do you know?" asked a third employee, her low ponytail slung over her shoulder. "Did anyone look at this one before it was sold?" "Someone would have noticed, wouldn't they?" the teenager asked. "I still think we should call the police," the woman in the ponytail said. "And say what?" said the teenager. "Hey, we think we've got a situation here. See, someone returned a toy, and funny story, now the toy looks too lifelike. Help, officer, help." "Keep your voice down," scolded the manager. "I mean, they can't actually be real, can they?" the woman asked. The other 2 said nothing, and, as though on cue, all 3 stepped away from the thing they were crowded around. There, on top of a small work table, sat a mangled box that looked like it had been rescued from a trash compactor. Its cellophane window was dingy, with white crease marks spread like veins across the front. The corners of the box were soft and worn, and the top flap was held together by a fuzzy strip of packing tape. But even through all this damage, Oscar could see a green head and bulging eyes. A plush trap chaser. Beyond Oscar, the crowd's unhappiness crescendoed into a roar, and the clerk suddenly appeared behind the boxes. He didn't notice Oscar, he was too panicked. "Help!" the clerk shouted at the other employees. "They're about to revolt." Before they turned, Oscar slid back around the boxes. The woman appeared behind the register, and the panicked clerk. Her name tag said, "Tanya, assistant manager." "I'm very sorry," Tanya called out, "but the plush trap toy is now out of stock." "No, it isn't," Oscar said, too quietly at first, and he was impossible to hear over the tumultuous crowd. When Tanya didn't respond, he shouted, "Hey!" She turned to him, her dark eyes intense. "What?" she snapped. "You have one back there," Oscar said. Maybe he accused. He pointed to where he knew the plush trap chaser was, behind the stacks of boxes. Tanya shot another look at the crowd, then glanced in the direction Oscar was pointing. She stared that way a little too long, then looked at Oscar like they were suddenly the only 2 people in the store. "That one's damaged," she said. "Looks fine to me," Oscar lied, pressing his luck. He wasn't sure what Tanya and the other employees had been talking about, but he was smart enough to know something weird happened to the returned plush trap chaser. He didn't care, though. His need for the toy was all-consuming. "It's not fine, kid. It's, defective." Tanya crossed her arms. "Trust me, you don't want that one." "But it's not for sale," Tanya said, through gritted teeth, before yelling into the crowd. "Folks, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sure we'll get some more at some point." Then she grumbled to herself, "We'd better." "When'll that be?" demanded a woman. I don't... "What am I supposed to tell my daughter?" a guy in a suit and tie asked. "Sir, you must... Your clerk said you had plush traps for everyone," hollered a lady. "I doubt," he said. The crowd was on the verge of mutiny, but Oscar barely registered them. "Dude, we better get out of here," Isaac said. "No joke," said Raj. "My mom dragged me to some sale on bedsheets once. When they ran out, I actually saw this one lady bite someone. They were out for blood." Isaac looked at Raj in horror. "I don't want to get bit." But Oscar was only half listening. I don't care if it's damaged. I'll buy it anyway, he said. People, please calm down, she yelled into the microphone as feedback pierced the air, making everyone pause for a moment to cover their ears. But that only seemed to rile them on even more, and soon customers were shoving and flooding the store, tearing toys off the shelves as they looked for hidden plush-trap chasers, like they were on some sort of demented Easter egg hunt. That's it, I'm calling security, Tanya yelled, then traded the microphone for the tan receiver under the cash register. I don't get paid enough for this. Come on, just let us buy the one you have back there, Oscar persisted. It was too much, the thought of leaving after coming this close. He couldn't bear it. Get lost, kid, Tanya yelled over her shoulder, before pressing the receiver to her ear. Where's Mr. Stanley? Tell him I need some help over here, she said into the phone. Then Tanya turned her back on the counter. Oscar didn't think. If he'd been thinking, he never would have run around the counter and behind the stacks of boxes. He never would have shoved aside the teenage employee and the maybe manager, who stood gaping at the crumpled 3-foot box standing between them. He sure wouldn't have grabbed the box. He wouldn't have hoisted it up, accidentally clipping the teenage staffer in the chin, while the clerk and Tanya yelled for Oscar to stop, to wait, to put it down. If he'd been thinking, Oscar would have answered Raj and Isaac when they suddenly appeared behind him, asking him what the heck he was doing. In that moment, the only thing bouncing around Oscar's head were Mr. Devereaux's words. The point is, quit tilling, it's time to pick. Oscar slammed their pile of pooled cash on top of the work table. He clutched the long, narrow box to his chest, turned, and ran around the counter. Then he dropped his shoulder to plow through the crowd that barely took notice of him, so invested they were in their own mayhem. Stop! Stop! Yelled the employees, but Oscar was already to the front door of the emporium, which was suddenly clear now that the crowd had moved inside. Dude, what are you doing? Called Raj. But he was nearly beside Oscar, so it was clear that whatever he was doing, he wasn't doing it alone. Oscar could hear Isaac's short legs working double time to keep up behind them. That way, the clerk yelled, still too close to Oscar to be comfortably far away. They took it! They stole it! Stop! Yelled another voice, and this one somehow sounded more authoritative. Aw, man, it's security, Isaac wheezed, and suddenly he was faster than Oscar and Raj, sprinting ahead of them and leading the way out of the mall, the east entrance now in sight. And that's all we're going to read for now. That's part 1 of Out of Stock. Part 2 is pretty interesting, and so is part 3, and so is literally everything in this series, let's be honest. So, yep, that's all for now. I'll try to get the second part out in 3 days, like I usually try to. And yes, it does somehow take that long, don't ask me. I don't know. But, yeah, alright, I never know how to end these videos, man. I need to come up with some outro or something. Alright, see you soon. Bye!